الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So I wanted to continue on in our series about Islam for children with another hadith which shows us the sweetness of faith. It shows us some of the characteristics that a person should contain in order to taste some of the sweetness of faith in Islam. عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: ثلاث ما كن فيه وجد بهن حلاوة الإيمان، من كان الله ورسوله أحب إليه مما سواهما، وأن يحب المرء لا يحبه إلا لله، وأن يكره أن يعود في كفر بعد أن أنقذه الله منه، كما يكره أن يقذف في النار. رواه البخاري وغيره. In this narration, which was related by Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, who was the servant of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, 3 people that if they contain these characteristics have tasted the sweetness of faith. He said the first is the person who Allah and His Messenger are more beloved to him than anything else. And the second one, he said, is the person who loves another person strictly for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He loves another believer only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for worldly affairs or anything, but he loves him for that person's obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that person is doing good deeds and they are a righteous person, so they love him strictly for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third person, the third characteristic, is the one that hates to return to disbelief after they have become Muslim. And they hate to, just as they hate to enter the hellfire. So these people have tasted the sweetness of faith. And again, to recap briefly, the first one was the person who loves Allah and His Messenger more than anything in the world, even more than their parents, and more than their teachers, and more than anyone, everyone in this life. And the second person, which exhibits the sweetness of faith, is the person who loves a person strictly for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third person is the one who is a believer and hates to go back to disbelief. He would hate to, especially those of us who have entered the faith of Islam, who have left other religions. You know, when you've tasted some of the sweetness of faith, you could never imagine yourself ever leaving the beauty of Islam, of the Islamic religion, and the sweetness and the brotherhood. That is if you've tasted real Iman. That is if you've learned what it really means to, in Islamic monotheism, what it means to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. This person has tasted the sweetness of faith, and they would hate to go back to any other life. Even if they become weak, they can never imagine themselves leaving Islam and going back to any other path, because they know that any other path leads to the hellfire. So those are the people who have tasted some of the sweetness of faith. And some of the benefits that we derive from this hadith, some of the benefits we gain from this hadith, one of the most important benefits is showing us that that love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has different levels. That there is the obligatory love, and there is the love that is not an obligation, but it is encouraged, or it is something that is recommended. And this first type of love is love for that is an obligation, and this is to stay away from those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited, and enjoying and doing those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to do. So the person who tries to stay away from sin and they try to do with the obligations, obedience to their parents, being respectful towards one another, doing charity towards one another, smiling at one another, greeting one another. These are acts of they have different levels. Some of those acts are an obligation. For example, it's obligatory to greet other Muslims. If they say salam alaikum, you say wa alaikum salam. It is also an obligation to be dutiful to one's parents, regardless of whether they're Muslim or not Muslim. You have to be obedient to them. If they tell you to do something, you have to do it unless it contradicts what Islam tells you. So anything they order you to do that is righteous, you must do it. So those are the types of obligation, and illustrates the kind of love and the kind of faith which is obligatory, that every Muslim must do. And the other type is the one that is not an obligation, but it is highly recommended, and that would be things like doing extra prayer, or staying away from things that are doubtful matters that you don't know if they're lawful or whether they're lawful or unlawful. So to stay away from the doubtful matters, the doubtful things that might lead you to sin, that this also is shows a kind of love, and it shows a type of strong faith, and this is the faith which is not an obligation, but that it is highly recommended, so that when you don't fall into the things which are prohibited in Islam. And some of the things that would help you to do this are things like doing extra prayer aside from the 5 times daily prayer that Muslims must do. So when you do, as the people usually call it, the Sunnah prayers and so forth, when you do these extra prayers, that this will help you in your obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and these extra prayers are not obligation, and that's why they're considered extra, because they're not an obligation. These are just some of the ways and some of the benefits that we gain from this hadith. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us all in the Iman, and to give us all guidance, and to help us to be on the straight path, and to stay away from the haramat, the things that are prohibited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and bless us to be of those who enjoy the good and who are guided. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us and grant us success in this life as well as the hereafter. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.